These lenses changed my life, and in this video, you'll find out why. Kia ora and welcome. Photography is a common hobby if you work in the optics industry. The background knowledge you have in your job definitely helps with this creative pursuit. Usually your smartphone is enough to get you started, but if you want to take the hobby a bit more seriously, you have to look at using your disposable income to purchase a camera and a lens. And that's what I want to talk about today. If you're looking at upping your photography game, a lot of emphasis is put on the camera body versus this probably isn't to a certain extent the most important thing. And sure, you need a camera that isn't too old, but something that's decently okay or decently priced and even secondhand may be sufficient for you. The most important thing is the lens. Now, not only does the lens give you a really good high quality photo, it can also up your photography skills. Let me explain. So normally when you buy a camera, it comes with a kit lens. I don't have a kit lens here to demonstrate with you, but usually a kit lens is like an entry level or a beginner lens that comes with a frame. It's a fairly inexpensive lens and it does have some benefits, like you're able to change the zoom, but the quality you get from a kit lens isn't the greatest. And this is opposed to having prime lenses. I've got two prime lenses here. I've got this lens here, which is the 20mm. I'll bring it into shot if it'll focus. Oh, there you go. That's the 20mm Nikkor 2.8D. And I have another lens, and this lens, sorry, costed me about $200 secondhand. And I've got a lens here. I'll just remove the cap. And this is the Nikkor, if I can get it into focus. It's a 50mm 1.8, also known as the Nifty 50. And this fella here costed me about $400 brand new. And these two lenses changed my life in the photography game anyway. When I mentioned 50mm, 20mm, I'm talking about focal length. If you have a very strong optics background, you can probably skip this part, but let's talk about what focal length is. And to put it simply, focal length in the game of photography is basically how much you can fit into a frame. So if you have a higher focal length lens or a telephoto lens, that means you're going to be more zoomed in on your whatever you're taking a photo of, as opposed to something with a smaller focal length where you'll be more zoomed up, you're able to fit more into that frame. But rather than thinking like this, think the telephoto lens will bring the background closer towards you versus a wide angle lens or a lens with a smaller focal length will push the background back and will allow more in shot, and it emphasizes that subject just a wee bit more. Another reason why these lenses are so good is we have to discuss what the exposure triangle is, because that's what represents the 1.8 with this lens and the 2.8 with this lens here. That's the size of the aperture. But let me explain the exposure triangle first. So with the exposure triangle, imagine you've got 3 points. You've got your shutter speed, then you have aperture, and you have ISO. So what is shutter speed? Shutter speed is how much the shutter opens to allow for exposure. If you have a very slow shutter speed, that means you have greater exposure, more light goes through, and you get a streaky sort of image. As opposed to a fast shutter speed where you don't get as much exposure, so you get a little bit less light, but you're able to freeze frame motion a lot better. Aperture relates to the depth of focus. So you can see how I'm in focus, but the background's blurry. That's called bokeh. When you have something that's wide open, a big aperture, you get a shallower depth of focus. That means I'm going to be in focus, and things that are outside of that depth of field or depth of focus is going to be a bit blurry. As opposed to if you have a very narrow aperture, then you get me in focus plus everything else behind me. Another thing to consider is if you have a wide open aperture, you get more light through, hence more exposure. If you have a smaller aperture, you get less light in, hence less exposure. And the third thing is ISO. That's really related to the camera sensitivity. So if you have a really high ISO, you're able to take photos in the dark, but the caveat for that is you get more noise. And so coming back to these lenses here, they have really low F numbers. That means the apertures can be opened really wide up, and that's what gives that really good selective focus where the subject's in focus, but everything else is blurry. And coming back to the zoom lenses or kit lenses, with kit lenses, you do have the advantage of being able to adjust the zoom, but the problem is with the aperture. A lot of them have very high F numbers, so the aperture is going to be relatively small, so you don't get that nice blurry selective focus. And another thing too is as you change the zoom of a kit lens, the aperture changes as well. You can get zoom lenses with a fixed aperture, but these lenses are really expensive and they're really heavy too, and they're most likely going to be used in a professional setting. Things like these lenses here, these prime lenses, you get almost professional level quality for a fraction of the cost. Now you're going to be thinking that having a fixed focal length or not being able to change zoom is a bad thing in photography, but let me tell you, it's going to improve photography game so much. Because with the prime lens you've got a fixed focal length, when you're looking at a shot you'll be thinking about what focal length to use. Now 50mm lens is really good for an all-rounder. It's good for street photography, or if you want to take portraits of people, and even landscapes. Now if you want to get the whole landscape in shot, you can use something like a 20mm lens, and the benefit of a 20mm lens is if you have a subject in front, it gets emphasized a bit more. And with prime lenses you'll be thinking about composition. Composition is basically what you have in shot. This is really important because now artificial intelligence can take a look at the shot and adjust the exposures and colors based on what's in the image. But a thing that's a lot difficult to automate is the composition, what you have in the shot. So instead of having the subject right in the middle of the shot, you have them just off center or in a rule of thirds. For example, with this shot here, my eye level is right on that top third. Another tip is with landscape shots, so try and introduce a little bit of depth. Have the background, but include elements in the foreground, like rocks. Finally, just as a reward for coming to the end of the video, I've had a lot of people ask what I use to shoot these videos with. And a lot of people think it's the really good camera that makes all this happen, but it's actually the lens. I use a Sony a6400, which is a relatively cheap camera to get 4K. The king of this is actually the lens, which is a 16mm Sigma lens. On top of that, I've got really good audio, as well as nice lights and a really good background with the Philips Hue bulbs there, which make up the entire shot. Now, I don't want to give away from this lens. It gives such a crisp image, and it has a very low f number, which makes me in focus, but makes the background completely blurry. And on top of that, with this type of focal length, I'm able to, touch the camera from an arm's length away. Anyway guys, thanks for watching. Here's a playlist on my journey through Vlogmas. Remember to stay focused and talk soon.